You founded Ada Lovelace Day in 2009, is that right?
Yes, it is.
What was your motivation for that?
So I was doing a lot of tech conferences in sort of through from mid-2000. So 2008, 2007, I was doing a lot of conferences. And it became really obvious very quickly that there were not very many women on stage. And every time that there was a new tech conference, there would be a discussion on the blogs about where are the women in tech. And quite often we would end up challenging the organizers and saying, this is either a fully male lineup or there's only one or two women. And you'd look at the audience and the audience would be very heavily skewed male. And we would get reactions back from organisers along the lines of, well, yeah, we asked women and they all said no. We couldn't find any women. And my favourite, there aren't any women in tech. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd because I'm kind of in tech and I'm pretty sure I'm a woman. I've got lots of friends who are women. So it seemed to be this odd issue where women weren't getting the opportunities to speak that men were getting. And every time someone would write a blog post and it'd be rant, and then in the comments it would be, tell us who you think ought to be on stage. And people would start listing women in tech. And I realized that even though I was alive to the issue of visibility of women in tech, I was struggling to name women who were senior, who were luminaries. I could name lots of my friends and say, these are women that I think are doing really cool things. But when it came to actually looking historically and looking at women who had achieved great things in technology, it was really hard even for me to name them. And I just thought, this is ridiculous. I need to know who these women are. And so the first Ada Lovelace Day was a day of blogging about women in tech. It was the 24th of March in 2009. Which was a completely random date I picked because I was impatient and I wanted it to happen soon. And it just really took off immediately. It was, I was quite astonished actually. I thought it would be kind of me and a couple of mates and we'd have a little blog thing going and that would be that. And in the end it was huge.
Why do you think it caught on like it did?
I think it really hit a nerve. And I think it was something that there were a lot of women who were angry about the state of play and about the issues around conferences, but the media caught on to it as well. So I found myself on sort of BBC News talking about Ada Lovelace Day, and there was a huge amount of media coverage, not just from journalists saying, this thing is going on, but also from journalists engaging with the day. So we saw a lot of columns about, well, these are my women in tech that I think are awesome, and looking at Ada Lovelace's work and other historic women. And it flew. And I really sort of felt for the next sort of 3 or 4 years that I was kind of running to catch up with where it had gone in that first year. And I think I sort of finally feel like I've got there, that I've kind of managed to grab hold of its coattails again and say, kind of pull it back under control. But it's been amazing.
What's the biggest issue you're running into with it right now?
The main problem, not just for me, but for other organisations dealing with women in STEM, is funding. A lot of the organisations that have started, so when I started Ada Lovelace Day, there were quite a lot of professional organisations, so BCS Women in the UK, the Women's Engineering Society, all of these sort of organisations that are affiliated to specific professions and professional bodies. There were quite a few grassroots organisations around as well, sort of like Girl Geek Dinners and the Blog Her Conference that had been going for a while.
Right.
But in the last 3-4 years, there's been an explosion of very small grassroots groups, some of whom are incredibly focused on one particular issue. And they're almost all run by either very, very small groups of women or individuals who, some of them have day jobs, some of them are freelance, and they are all at a scale where getting funding is phenomenally difficult. And they're all hampered by a lack of cash, basically. So when I was back in the UK in June, I put together a funding meeting and got as many women and men from these sorts of organisations together as possible. And everyone has the same issue. They're sort of too small and they lack the resources to go after the sort of major sources of funding. So, grants and government funding is out of reach. And lack the sort of time and resources and experience to go after, say, corporate funding. So Ada Lovelace Day has been funded. We've got a number of sponsors that have allowed me since January of this year to go full-time working on it. But that came through really by luck. I didn't have the infrastructure to be searching for funding, and I'm very lucky that it came to me. Mm-hmm. But that funding issue is a major problem because it's really preventing what I think would be very rapid growth in support organisations for women in tech and in STEM.
That's interesting, because it's related to the next question I have for you, which is, are there particular groups or organizations that you feel are doing exemplary work in relation to equality and technology?
There are a lot of groups doing fantastic stuff, and really sort of too many to go through, but some of the groups that I really think are doing fantastic work. There's a woman called Dr. Sue Black in the UK who has a program called Tech Mums, and the premise of this is if you teach mums especially to code, you're not just empowering them and reskilling them and giving them new career opportunities, and particularly flexible career opportunities because of the way that you can do remote working. You are also empowering them to empower their children. And so if you have a generation of mums who understand technology, who feel confident with technology, they pass that on, not just to their sons, but to their daughters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an incredibly important way forward in terms of bringing a new generation of women into technology and into STEM. That's interesting.
That's really interesting. So it's very proactive, looking for opportunities to not just expand to one particular group, but to have repercussions beyond that as well. You started consulting on social media in 2004, is that right?
Yes.
What was the social media landscape like in 2004? I was trying to think back on it. What was that?
So we didn't even use the word social media at that point. I mean, my first job title, my first self-given job title was blog consultant, which sounds like really twee now. You kind of think, who would focus just on blogs? But I started blogging in 2001 and started getting involved in what we would now call social media, so wikis, and using wikis in enterprise and looking at how we can use blogs especially to facilitate communication. And I had a particular interest in what happens inside businesses. So how can you get people off email and onto social tools? And so there were some enterprise platforms that were around at the time, and blogging was a big part of that. So there was a big push to install blogs internally, and that sort of met with varying degrees of success. A lot of the time it was about execution rather than the tools, though. Mm-hmm. So there was a habit that people had of, we'll just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And it wasn't long before it was like, actually, we kind of know what you need to do. There are key things that have to be in place before you can actually find success with sort of social media internally. Mm-hmm. So it was a really exciting time. I mean, I remember coming over to San Francisco, must have been 2005, and trying to meet up with everybody who did this kind of work, and finding very few people doing that. I mean, certainly in the UK there was only a handful of us. And there was a lot of attitude about, this will never fly. No one will ever pay for this kind of consulting. You're deluding yourself.
Sure, right.
And 10 years later, all the big agencies are into it, and everybody all the big companies have internal social media teams, and it's a big part of how we do business now.
Yeah, that whole concept of a social media team, I remember when that first popped up, it's like, oh, come on, we really need a social media? Now it's just a default, it's a core component. Digital natives, this is a term that comes up a lot, and there seems to be this assumption that a digital native sort of inherently understands things to a degree that non-digital natives don't. What's your take on that?
I think it's complete nonsense. Not to put a finer point on it. It is. I mean, every generation creates some kind of barrier between them and the people who are younger than them. And you know, I mean, this goes back, you can see kind of, you know, Greek philosophers complaining about the youth today, you know, writing things down instead of memorizing them and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's a natural sort of part of, you know, as you grow older, you start to look at the generation below you and see differences instead of similarities. But with technology, you know, no one is born understanding how to use an iPhone or a Mac or whatever. You know, this is stuff that you learn. And that means that if this is stuff that you learn, whether and how deeply you learn it depends a lot on your exposure to it. So there are still a lot of kids who are maybe not interested in tech, they're more interested in sport or art. There are kids who don't have access. So maybe their parents either haven't prioritized or can't afford to have technology around. There are kids who are prevented from gaining access because maybe their parents believe that this is not appropriate for them. So there is a huge variety and a huge spectrum in the experience of technology that young people have. And it is very poor of us, of our generation, to be looking only at the tech-enabled kids and saying that they represent all kids, because they don't. Right. And I think it's very dangerous as well for us to be looking at them as the trendsetters, because they're only representative of their little bit of the demographic. And if we focus on them to the exclusion of kids who don't have access or who don't have interest, then what we're doing is we're actually cutting out a good chunk of the next generation and saying that they're not important to us. And we have to think very carefully about how we communicate about technology and about science to kids for whom this is not something that's normal within their immediate surrounds. So going back to the women in STEM, one of the predictors of how well a girl will do in STEM subjects is how much STEM capital there is in her family. So that's like if her parents are in STEM, you know, if her dad's in tech, if her mum's in tech, then she'll be more likely to go on into tech. And so when we are thinking about these generational changes, yes, there are changes in attitudes, but that's a cultural thing, and we need to be careful that we don't generalize excessively from the one part of the next generation that we identify with. Right. We have to look outside of that and say, what about the kids who don't have access? How do we reach them? How do we empower them? How do we make sure that they have the understanding they need? Because the world is increasingly digital and they're at a disadvantage by not having access. So how do we make sure that they are empowered as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was teaching some classes to undergraduates who, and this was right when the first concept of digital native was taking root. And it was very clear very quickly that while they were comfortable with certain types of technology, that didn't mean that they understood all of the nuance, right? It's not like they came fully formed and could develop a social media campaign for you, right? Exactly. Like they just didn't necessarily know it. And what I found was some of the other instructors that I was working with were making conclusions about these students, and they were not giving the students what they needed in that regard.
And I think it is problematic because being able to use a subset of technology, for example, using your phone to access Facebook, does not mean that you understand how the rest of the internet works. Right. And in fact, we had this experience a few years back. My husband's stepniece came to stay, and we were saying, oh, you know, if you want to go to we were in London at the time, you know, if you want to go to the Tower of London, it's really cool, and there's lots of stuff there. And you can book tickets on the internet. And gave her my laptop, and she didn't know what to do with it. But she didn't know how to search the internet. Right. As far as she was concerned, the internet was Facebook, and she didn't know how to use a URL because her browser just automatically goes into Facebook at home. It's set up to just, that's the opening page. She was completely lost. Right. And so, you know, that sense of, oh, they all know how to use it. Well, we have to make sure that we're not making assumptions based on a superficial understanding of how they're using technology. And I think, you know, this is all really important because what you see, and going back to social media, is this big push at the moment, and really sort of like for the last 3 or 4 years, the social media is a young person's area of expertise. Yes. So you get kind of companies saying, well, we'll get the intern to do the social media account. The intern who maybe doesn't have the emotional maturity to deal with complaints and problems, who maybe isn't fully aware of how to communicate in a sort of to a mass audience like on Twitter. And there's a degree of ageism involved. Because when you actually look at the people who have that experience and who understand social technology, there are a lot of people who actually were there from the beginning, who are in their sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, who understand this stuff implicitly. You know, it's not that they are digital natives. They created the digital reality that so-called digital natives now inhabit. So they understand it from the bottom up because they built it.
Sure, they literally built the thing.
They literally built it. And so when people of that age group are being dismissed as being not social media aware because of their age, we're actually storing up problems, because what we're doing is that expertise is not being transferred down the line to the younger kids, because the younger kids are coming in, they're getting kind of fairly senior roles very young when they really don't have the breadth of expertise. So we're really kind of creating future problems, and I think social media has stagnated in terms of the way that it's used and the way that it's developed, because we haven't actually had that sort of knowledge transfer, and because actually the older you get, the harder it is to be taken seriously if you're in social media. So there's this kind of like odd dynamic that's developed over the last sort of like 5 years, where sort of C-level executives are saying, you know, this is a young person's game, and they're cutting out all of the expertise from people who've been doing this for over a decade, the people who invented it, the people who actually sort of built the world that they now take for granted. So I think there's an awful lot of thinking that needs to be done about exactly how we use social media and who we get, who we learn about social media from.
How do you see that playing out? I mean, is that going to fix itself, or is that going to take some catalysts to make it better?
I think it needs somebody to really start making the point. I think part of the issue, though, is, you know, going back to the generational divides that we create. If you think about how very senior executives sometimes deal with technology, you definitely see this trend of kind of like going, you know, put the barriers up. This is a young person's game. Therefore, not only do I not need to learn about it, and I shouldn't learn about it because I'm old, and I'll never understand it because digital native. Right? And so it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating division that satisfies the emotional needs of the sort of C-level suite, and that they don't want to have to engage with it, so they push it off to younger folks and say, you know, that's your domain, and you know, never the twain shall meet.
There's sometimes a weird sense of pride too, and well, I'm not on email, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not.
I mean, you see that too with not just with technology, but also with science. So there's this sort of sense of like, well, you know, I don't understand any of that science stuff. And this sort of...
That's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing. I mean, how many people would turn around and say, well, I don't understand Shakespeare. Why would I ever read Shakespeare? You know, I mean, it wouldn't happen. That's a good point. From the other direction. And it really is a sort of, you know, see peace knows two cultures. And how we bridge those. And it's a very difficult area to operate in, because neither side is actually that comfortable with the idea of meeting. So there's a lot of bridge building that still needs to be done. I don't know how it's going to happen, because I'm not sure that people are taking it seriously.
I want to double back to something. You were talking about blogging earlier, and I have a real soft spot for blogging myself. What's your thoughts on the state of blogging?
State of blogging.
Please don't say it's dead.
No, I don't think it's dead. I think it has suffered mightily from the general loss of RSS. I think, you know, RSS was a kind of really important glue that a lot of technologies relied upon to feed things into one another, and the fact that it became unfashionable to think about RSS and closure of Google Reader and all the rest of it has really had a negative impact, I think, on how easy it is for bloggers to reach an audience. No one reads my blog unless I tweet stuff. I mean, it's amazing, It's if I can write a blog post, it doesn't matter what the blog post is about. If I don't tweet it, no one will read it.
It's as though it's in private mode.
It's, if a blog's written in the forest and no one tweets about it, does it exist?
Right.
And probably not.
Is it a journal at that point, right?
And I think part of it's, we've had a lot of fragmentation. So, it used to be that you kind of had, Blogger and WordPress and LiveJournal and movable type. And now you've got, Tumblr and Medium and, Vox and all these different platforms, all these sort of ways you can communicate. You've got Facebook, a lot of people communicating more visually through photography, through Instagram. Twitter is kind of like really where people are getting their news from a lot now. So your attention is fragmented, which makes it a lot harder to actually follow blogs. And I, in the end, kind of ran away from my RSS reader because there were too many unread posts in it. And periodically I kind of just mark them all read and cull the list, and it never worked.
The great RSS purge, right?
It is, because now stuff kind of falls in your lap. And you have a limited amount of time each day to spend reading the internet. You could spend your whole life reading the internet and never get to the bottom of it. And there's just more content being produced that it becomes impossible as a reader to. I don't even get to read the stuff I want to read.
Yeah.
So I find it. I don't write as much as I used to. Partly that's time. I still kind of find myself walking down the road. I must blog about that later, and
Sure.
It's got to be a really burning issue for me now to kind of I'm going to carve out some time to write a blog post. It's because I'm not good at brief. I don't do that. I always used to say, just do one paragraph, and then kind of like 3,000 words later, you're like, that didn't work.
It's either going to be a lot or it's just going to be aspirational. Right?
Well, it's going to either be a lot or it's going to be Twitter, right?
Right.
That's kind of how it is. I don't think blogging's going anywhere, but I think I don't think it's going to come back either to the levels that it was like 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, I think about when I started, actually it's longer than that, 2001, I was kind of chronically underemployed. I was stuck living in Dorset, miles from nowhere. And blogging really was a way for me to connect with people. And it was one of the first times in my life that I felt I found a true peer group, was through meeting other bloggers. Because suddenly I knew all these people who were into the same kind of tech that I was into, didn't feel like this kind of slightly peculiar weirdo. I kind of felt normal and felt like, these people understand me. And I'm still very good friends with a lot of people that I met back then, but none of us blog as much as we used to. And I think in part that's because we get our social connections online through things like Twitter. So that side of things is satisfied through more immediate tools.
That's interesting. I hadn't really considered that, the division between the act of writing on a blog and that's one outlet, and that the social component that has largely been addressed by tools that frankly are easier to use and faster. And so maybe part of that evolution was simply that it wasn't so much that people were necessarily looking for the writing outlet, they were looking for the social component, and they found that elsewhere. Yeah.
I mean, because comments sections used to be so vibrant, and we would have these long rambling conversations, and it was always very interesting, the other people's points of view. And now I write a blog post. If someone's going to comment, it's almost always through Twitter.
Right.
So your blog post, all that goes through Twitter. And you even end up trying to have these like detailed conversations through Twitter, which is really not designed for at all. And I'm kind of, why is that not on the blog? I mean, you've just sent me like 10 tweets in a row because you couldn't fit it all in. Why did you not just like put that in a comment?
Yes.
But I think it's about the immediacy of it, and that and we like immediacy. I mean, it's that little that sort of social hit that you get when someone replies to something and you want it there and it's right in front of you.
Right.
And you don't get, if you've got to write a comment on a blog, that's kind of like 10 minutes writing, and they may not see it for 24 hours.
Yeah. And it's just kind of right there. There isn't the chance that somebody else maybe is going to necessarily see it either, right? Yeah. With Twitter, you've got that chance of that serendipitous exposure. What people or projects are you following these days?
I'm obviously following a lot of stuff in the women in STEM arena. So I mentioned Sue Blacker. There's also Trailblazers, which is celebrating women who work with trowels. So archaeologists, paleontologists, geologists. And I love that whole branding. It's absolutely wonderful.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Tori Herridge doing some brilliant stuff. But also I'm a lapsed geologist is how I think of myself. So I like to keep an eye on what's happening in the world of geophysical hazards especially. So reading up a lot on the Cascadia fault zone at the moment, the subduction zone. There was that really great New Yorker article, and then I brought Sandy Broughton's Full Rip 9.0. It's a terribly dramatic sounding book. It's brilliantly written. It's a really great read. It arrived on Monday, just before I left for the airport, and I got through half of it on the plane. So, no working on the plane for me. It was just like, this is gripping. And I try and keep abreast of what's happening with volcanoes around the world. So I've had one experience where my professional life, my sort of consulting life, has overlapped with my degree, which was actually around the Eyjafjallajökull eruption in 2010.
Really?
And I ended up doing a piece of work for Chatham House about the media response. So I went and analysed samples of media coverage of the ash cloud disruption and looked at what kind of voices dominated the conversation. And found somewhat unsurprisingly that it was mainly passenger airlines were dominating the conversation. So over scientists, meteorologists, cargo companies. So a lot of people were affected, but the human story of oh dear, someone on holiday is stuck in Egypt or whatever was the main narrative. But it was really interesting because there was a lot to learn about high impact, low probability events from Eyjafjallajökull.
Interesting.
So I like to keep an eye on what's going on. I don't get to spend quite as much time watching webcams of volcanoes erupting as I used to. But it's amazing, they're all so well monitored now. That there's quite a lot of an eruption happens, and you can go and watch it in real time.
Is that right?
On the webcam.
It's not as much of a novelty anymore.
Actually, I think it gives us a much better understanding in terms of science communication, to be able to say this eruption is happening, and we have this imagery, and you can go and watch it on the webcam, and it gives people, I think, a much sharper idea of the impact that it's having on the local people. And I think that's really important because we need to understand the geophysical events like eruptions and earthquakes are they're interesting scientifically, but they also have an impact on the populations that are affected. And it's much easier to communicate that now than it used to be. It used to be quite kind of like 5,000 people displaced. Now you see the houses covered in ash, and you can empathise a lot more with the people who are affected by it. And I think that's really important in terms of encouraging people to support those communities, but also in terms of preparedness. So being in San Francisco, I've had a lot of conversations about earthquake preparedness, and it's something that is very easy to think this is never going to happen. It's not going to be we're not going to be affected. Not in my lifetime, and it's true. Maybe it won't happen in our lifetime, but you still have to be prepared for it. And that's, I think, of all the sort of science communication challenges, the sort of high impact, low probability event communication stuff is really, really challenging.
Right.
Because how do you get people to spend time, money, and emotion on something that may never happen?
Right. A lot of more post attitude as opposed to pre.
Yeah. Right. And once you start getting into the politics of it, it becomes even thornier because how do you encourage politicians who are notoriously short-term in their outlook to start thinking about long-term?
Right.
And again, I'm a big fan of cross-pollination between different disciplines. I think there are lessons there as well for technology. Technology moves very fast, but we need to think long-term about the impacts on society. And that's something that we all need to be a part of that debate. And that doesn't happen enough. We tend to be very focused on, who's just done an IPO and who's just launched and, what the new Apple device is and all the rest of it. And we need to as a broad community, also be thinking about the long-term impacts societally. So in terms of how we are bringing in different points of view. This is where diversity becomes important, because different people have different experiences of the world, and that should inform our longer debate on how we want to mediate the relationship between society and technology.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this. Really, really appreciate it.
It's been great.